Hey there! Today on Big Out Books, I'm going to be doing my belated November wrap-up. I really admire and respect all of the hardworking content creators on BookTube who are just crushing it in the content department right now. So many people are putting out all these great videos. Some people are even doing daily videos for Vlogmas. And then meanwhile, over here, I'm the kind of mess that realizes that the halfway point of the month is fast approaching and I still haven't wrapped up the previous month, so I'm sorry that I'm not in their league, but I'm still very excited to talk about the books that I read in November. So if we dial back the clock a little bit, I participated in Nonfiction November this month. I don't think that there are a lot of real rules for this readathon. I think the main goal is just to read more nonfiction than you usually would, which I would say I was successful at. So I read 8 books this month, and 5 of those books were works of nonfiction. So usually I'm trying to read about 1 or 2 works of nonfiction a month, so to get to 5 was pretty good, and I actually think that I was enjoying the nonfiction that I was reading even more than the novels that I read. So I think that's where we're going to start off this video with some of the nonfiction that I got to this month. The first work of nonfiction that I read this month was a depressing one, and that was The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and this one's written by Michelle Alexander. So this is a book about the criminal justice system in the US and how the war on drugs is being used as this tool to unfairly target and criminalize African Americans. So Alexander is making the point that basically today in the United States, the only people that you can really openly discriminate against are people who have been convicted of crimes. So these are people who have their voting rights taken away in some cases, people who are not allowed to live wherever they choose, and people who aren't allowed to work at certain jobs. So basically Alexander is arguing that the criminal justice system uses this as a way to maintain racial control in the United States. So definitely some provocative ideas being explored in this book, although I can't say that I always agreed with Alexander, nor did I always think that her statistics that she was using to make these points were always convincing. The arguments can get quite heavy-handed in this book, and sometimes Alexander makes some very sweeping generalizations about American society as a whole that didn't always sit right with me. But I will say that though I didn't always enjoy how the arguments were presented, I think that there still are a lot of valuable ideas in this book, especially about how racial bias and discrimination is still alive and well in the criminal justice system, but it's very hard to acknowledge these issues or to actually make any changes in this era of color blindness, where basically people act like these sort of things don't exist anymore. I also have to agree that the war on drugs seems pretty extreme, especially reading this now as a Canadian where my country has recently legalized marijuana. It made me very sad reading about some of the young people in this book whose futures have been completely destroyed because they were caught and charged with possession for just small amounts of marijuana. So it does seem sad that people's lives are ruined in a very real way over these sorts of policies. So I didn't always love the way that these arguments were presented or the very biased way that this text was constructed, but I still think that there are a lot of intriguing ideas in here, and I'm glad that I gave it a try. After reading The New Jim Crow, I then picked up The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This is an essay that I've been meaning to read for a long time, but Michelle Alexander references it in her book, so I knew that this was the month to finally read it, and I'm so glad that I did. James Baldwin just always impresses me. His prose is just gorgeous, and his ideas are so powerful and direct. I just love the way that he presents them. This is an essay about race in America and the problems that it creates. He really makes it apparent that race is not just an issue that African Americans need to be thinking about, but it's something that is super essential for white people to be examining as well and looking for solutions going forward. Of course, this essay is not just about race, and there are so many incredible ideas in here about what it means to be living a good life, and there was a line in here that really struck me, and it was about death, which is something that I'm pretty uncomfortable thinking about. Like, I feel like I've got some anxieties about what death means, but there was one line in this book that just blew me away, and it was this: "It seems to me that one ought to rejoice in the fact of death, ought to decide, indeed, to earn one's death by confronting with passion the conundrum of life. So that's kind of a new attitude I'm trying to adopt in my life. I'm really trying to earn my good death by being as passionate as I can while I'm here. So James Baldwin, so valuable, so great, so glad that I gave this one a go. Taking a break from all the heavy stuff for a minute, I have a delightful collection of essays to talk about, and that is Demon Voices on Stories and Storytelling by Philip Pullman. Now, I'm by no means a Philip Pullman superfan or anything. I really do enjoy his Dark Materials trilogy, but that's the only thing I've ever read by him. So I have to say, getting this collection of essays was a bit of a cover buy, because I could not turn down this book with a raven on the cover, but I'm just super glad that I invested in this book because it was just so delightful and it was so thought-provoking and it was just so much fun. So I've been really interested in the craft of storytelling this year. So that's really just what all these essays are concerned about. How do you tell a good story? How does that change when you're telling the story for children? How do you tell a story through art without using words? I was just loved hearing Pullman's ideas. He has such a creative mind and such a simple and direct way of expressing his thoughts. He's really not a pretentious man. Sometimes I feel like he is a little bit curmudgeonly and he has these cranky opinions. He doesn't like being labeled a fantasy writer and he doesn't like Lord of the Rings. So he sort of repeats some of his crusty statements throughout this book a few times, but that's okay because I would say for most of the time he's pretty good company, and he writes about some really fascinating topics like Paradise Lost and William Blake and how that's inspired his work. Also, Philip Pullman worked as a teacher, so I thought his thoughts on education and what we should be doing in schools were also really valuable, so I had just a lot of fun reading this book, way more than I expected to. So I am so glad that I read this, and it's totally one that I can see myself returning to because it was just so pleasant, and I'd love to revisit some of his thoughts. My Canadian pick of the month was The Land We Are, Artists and Writers Unsettle the Politics of Reconciliation, which was edited by Gabrielle Hill and Sophie McCall. So reconciliation is a movement in Canada. It's a term that the government uses to describe acknowledging the wrongs of the past that have gone on with settler colonialism and trying to pave a positive way forward to build stronger relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So the artists and writers contributing to this collection are, of course, quite skeptical about this reconciliation movement, and they wonder whether reconciliation is being used as a way to put all the wrongs of settler colonialism as things that happened in the past, and not really acknowledging some of the current things that are going wrong today, including missing and murdered Indigenous women, and also unresolved land claims. So it was a really intriguing book that asks a lot of provocative questions. And what I like about this book is that it's not really a dry collection of essays, but as you can see, it's really creative how these texts are put together, and there's just lots of photos and poems, and it's just kind of a joy to flip through these pages. So this book is really about how we use art to make change. So maybe it's not that a piece of art is going to change the world, but it might provoke a response in the person who participates in this experience. It might create discomfort, which will then lead a person to go and learn some more. So I really liked this collection. The only thing that I didn't love about it is that sometimes it's not really satisfying to just read about a work of art, and I could see that a lot of these pieces would be a lot more powerful if I were actually lucky enough to experience them and see them for myself, but rather I had to read these kind of technical academic descriptions sometimes. So that was the only thing I had against this book, but overall I thought it was a really cool project. And according to my year-end review on Goodreads, this is the most obscure book that I read this year, with only 11 other people marking it as read on Goodreads this year. So it might be hard to find, and not easy to track down, but I think this was a really cool book that got me thinking about reconciliation in a few different ways. I also managed to squeeze in another nonfiction read by listening to an audiobook this month, and I listened to Roomful of Mirrors, which is a biography of Jimi Hendrix by Charles R. Cross. Now, he's an author that I'm kind of on the fence about, especially he wrote this one, Heavier Than Heaven, which is a biography of Kurt Cobain. It's probably been like 10 years since I read this thing, but it made me so mad because in the last chapter, as we all know with Kurt Cobain's life story, it doesn't end well, but Charles R. Cross makes this very strange move where he tries to narrate what Kurt Cobain is thinking in those moments that he's ending his life, and I just thought that was so uncomfortable and inappropriate and unprofessional that I don't really always trust this man's judgment. But I can say he is a lot more tame in this Jimi Hendrix biography. There wasn't as much wild speculation. And in fact, I would say it was almost the opposite, where it was pretty boring in some cases. So a book about a rock star from the 70s shouldn't really be dry, but this was sometimes, and I think the stiff, straight-laced audiobook narrator didn't really help matters. But that being said, it was just cool to learn more about Jimi Hendrix. I've always admired Jimi Hendrix as a musician, but it was great to learn a bit more about his personal life, and he came from this deeply dysfunctional family, and they didn't have a lot of money, so Jimmy went around strumming a broomstick for many years because he couldn't afford a guitar. And he also failed music class, which was kind of sad and surprising. So it was really interesting to learn about who he was, where he came from. But one thing I'll say is this biography is about over 9 hours, and he only lives to 27, so there's not a lot that happens to maybe justify the length of this. It can get a bit repetitive. But that being said, I'm happy to know more about Jimi Hendrix, so I'm glad that I gave this a listen. The final book that I read for Nonfiction November was The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. This is a bit of a beast, so I'm very proud of myself for finishing this book this month. I think I finished about a third of it back in July, and then I took a few months off, but I did manage to finish the rest of this book this month, so I'm pretty proud to make it through this thing. It was quite the ride. I'm so glad I checked out this book. So not only is it regarded as a pivotal work of feminism, but also it is a work of existential philosophy. This book isn't just about how women are treated unequally, but it's about larger power structures in society and how humans view each other as individuals. So for women, we know that we are fully active, conscious subjects, but yet in society, there's this tendency to treat men like they are the subjects and women are treated as this passive other. So this can create a lot of tension in a woman's life where she knows that she's an active subject, but yet she's expected to play this role where she is this passive object. So that can create a lot of clashes. So it was fascinating to read this book from a more philosophical angle. The first half of this book about the women's role over history and how that has changed was actually mind-blowing. It went through so many years of human history, and I thought it was just fascinating. The second half of this book then takes apart every part of a woman's life and looks at it in closer detail. So going from childhood through to marriage, through to old age. So that part was also pretty fascinating. And I have to say that Simone de Beauvoir just is so impressive as an intellectual. She uses so many sources in her book, and there's so many quotes from literature. So she is very well read, and she uses lots of different examples to try to illustrate her points. So she's just a fascinating mind to interact with. So of course, all these years later, we're not going to agree with everything that Simone says, but it is just fascinating to hear what she has to say on this topic. So I can totally see why this is such a groundbreaking work. And though it could be a bit tedious at times over the course of 700 pages, I'm so glad that I went along on this journey. This was such an incredible read. Moving on into the fiction that I read, I made it through 2 novels this month. One of them was Autumn by Ali Smith. I was pretty excited to find this at a used bookstore because I don't know about you, but I knew that I would have to read Autumn in the autumn. So if I didn't get to it this year, I would have to wait until next year. So this was a really fast, fun, easy read. I feel like because Ali Smith novels have like such large font that you really feel like you're just like flying through these books. And maybe it's because I was reading so much heavy-duty nonfiction. This just felt like a sheer delight compared to all of that. It's very witty and fun and fast-paced. So this is a novel that is kind of billed as the first Brexit novel. And though it does deal with the subject, I wouldn't say that it's that nuanced of a portrayal of Brexit. I'm not sure I came away from this with like a much greater understanding of what it's like to live in post-Brexit England, but still, this was just like a really fun book that described a really cute friendship between an old man and a young girl in like an innocent, neighborly way where they're like exploring art. So I support that kind of friendship. And there was a hilarious scene in here at a post office that I loved. There were some components in this book that didn't work as well for me, like all of the pieces about a pop artist who is talked about a lot in this book. So I feel like I could benefit from a reread since I felt like I kind of like whizzed through it. But that being said, I'm glad that I read it, and I will definitely continue on with Ali Smith's seasonal quartet. I've heard a lot of great things about winter, so I'm excited to give that one a try in December. The final novel that I read this month was Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. This is the first book I've read by this author, and usually after I finish reading a book, I will take a few days and kind of solidify my feelings of the reading experience, but this is just like one of those rare books that totally perplexed me. I cannot tell you if this is a good book or a bad book, but what I can tell you is that I did not enjoy the act of reading this book for the most part. It is one of those situations where the main character at the heart of this narrative is a pretty unlikable guy, so he's not fun to spend a lot of time with. And now I'm not usually one of those readers that is affected by that. Like, I don't need a likable character. I don't need to root for the characters, but I don't know, I found this man just like kind of distasteful, and I think it's because he's in the center of the narrative as kind of this like redemptive character that's going through this process of grace that I wasn't interested in his journey, I guess. The main character of this book is a middle-aged professor who ends up seducing one of his students, which is one of the cringiest scenes I've ever read, since he's trying to like hit on this college girl by whispering lines of Shakespeare to her, so that was like super uncomfortable. And then he gets in trouble with his university and he ends up leaving his job and moving onto a farm with his daughter where even more terrible things happen. And then he gets a job working with dogs who have to be put down in large numbers, and it's just like there's a lot of like sad and upsetting things that are happening, and I'm not sure if it really built into anything that was like cathartic or made it really worth going through all of those feelings. There are a lot of people out there who speak really highly of this book. It did win the Man Booker Prize, and a lot of people think it's a great representative of the post-apartheid South African experience. And one thing that I do really respect about this book is that there's like so much ambiguity, and it does stir up a lot of uncomfortable feelings in the reader, and this book is not really here to give you easy answers or easy solutions. So in some ways I respect that about this book, but that doesn't really mean that I had a good time reading this book. So I can maybe respect it and see what it's trying to do, but I still at the same time can't say that I loved reading it. So I had been really looking forward to this one, but it just wasn't really for me. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be reaching for any Coetzee anytime soon, though I think I should give him a second chance someday. The final book I have to talk about is an iconic short story collection, and that is What We Talk About When We Talk About Love by Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver's name always comes up when you hear about American authors who mastered the short story. So I went into this knowing that these were going to be some very well-crafted short stories, but I wasn't expecting to enjoy them as much as I did. I really was hooked on this collection from the very first story in. There is something that is very sparse and stripped down and minimal about these stories, and yet they're so deeply messed up And the people in these stories just seem so kind of sad in a lot of ways that these stories just leave you with a lot of questions and a lot of different ways to interpret what's happening. So I just found them fascinating. And some of these stories really did surprise me with how dark they got. There were some real violent twists in some of these stories, or like characters who would just say like deeply inappropriate things. So I don't know, I just found these stories so weird, but like I couldn't look away from them. I'm so glad that I read the short story collection finally. Like I said, I expected to appreciate the craft of these stories, but I didn't expect to get as invested in the stories as I did. So I'm so glad that I read this, and luckily Raymond Carver wrote a lot more short stories, so excited to keep diving into his works. So that's it for the books that I read this November. Since we're almost halfway through the month of December, I can safely say that I have read some amazing books already this month, and that I am going to end my reading year on a strong note because December reading is going really well. So excited to check back in with you about my December reading. Thanks for stopping by, and talk to you later. Bye.